Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Department at the University of Victoria. He's a PhD from Princeton and comes to Victoria via stops at Carnegie Mellon and Logic.
Yeah, I work with
So he's going to be talking about music-specific audio analysis. And so what he's going to say.
Okay, so first of all, I just wanted to put a picture of the University of Victoria because it's a pretty nice place and it's relatively near here. So if anytime any of you want to visit, just drop me an email and we can work something out. So overview, this is a quick overview of my talk. I'm going to cover very quickly a little bit of my background, which Cormac already mentioned, and then talk about why music is interesting, both from a perspective of interest in terms of users and also from a more kind of scientific perspective or research perspective. And then the main bulk of my talk is going to be on content-based music analysis, a little bit about future challenges. And then in the end, I'll just very, very quickly do a snapshot overview of what I'm currently doing at UVic. So my background, I did my PhD at Princeton with Perry Cook on music and audio retrieval. I did a postdoc at CMU with Roger Dannenberg. And I also worked with the Informedia group that does a lot of, some of you might know, a lot of video and audio retrieval. And I've done some consulting on audio fingerprinting for mood logic and real-time music speech classification for All Music, company called All Music that's in the Netherlands. Oh, someone I would never expect to be here. Okay, so why music? Music is, this is a relatively loaded slide with pictures, but it's kind of fun. What I want to convey with this slide is that music is a global thing. It has been with humanity since ancient times. These are, I think, 10,000 before Christ, prehistoric flutes, ancient Egyptian musicians. So pretty much there's no culture in the world that doesn't have music, and it's pervasive, and it's very, very diverse, and it's definitely something interesting. I mean, if we think about it, the fact that we listen to organized collections of air vibrations and somehow find them fascinating enough to spend so much time listening to them is a very bizarre thing in some ways, but it's definitely very pervasive. So music today, I'm sorry I have to go with iTunes, but they are sort of what they are. So iTunes recently reached 100 million purchased songs. So that's at least an indication that legal music purchasing in the digital domain can work. And you can fit 10,000 in an iPod. 60 or 80% of ISP bandwidth, and that's an anecdotal kind of statistic, is taken by people transferring legal and illegal MP3 files. So it's a big thing. Another indication that it's a big thing is that the whole dispute between the European Union and Microsoft was about the inclusion or not the inclusion of the media player. It wasn't, they didn't care about Minesweeper or the calculator. They cared about, the media player. So it is really important. Music is an important part. People use computers a lot to listen to music these days. And one, just as a note, even our imagination and sort of our science fiction vision of the future includes music in some way. So if you have Hal singing, for those of you who know this movie, for the interns who don't know this movie, I highly recommend you to find out what this is and watch it. Here's another example. So anyway, so what we imagine to be the artificial intelligence, if you want, of the future, or at least what artists imagine that the intelligence of the future is, has a very strong musical component. So music is, so the real reason now why I actually do music research is that it's more fun than other types of multimedia analysis and retrieval. It has a large user base, and mainly the main thing is I'm never tired of listening to music I like. So I come from a background from image and video processing. And if any of you have done work in that area, you probably recognize these two images. A lot of conference papers include those images. Now, you might be wondering why Madeleine Albright is there. That's one of the tasks in Trek video retrieval. So personally, I prefer to listen to Miles Davis than be searching in, 60 hours of audio about the clips where Madeleine Albright is talking. So that's just a personal preference. So anyway, the not so far future of music retrieval is, the way I see it, is you will have a library of all recorded music. Everything ever produced, everything that exists on the planet will be in a small device that you will be able to listen to. So the main, the name of the game is how can you search, organize, classify, retrieve, browse, how can you deal with all that information in interesting ways. And I have some examples of things that I would like to be able to do. I would like to be able to say, okay, here I love Janis Joplin as a singer. Unfortunately, she's dead. Is there any singer out there that sounds like her that I don't know about? I'm a saxophone player, so I'm really interested in saxophone solos. So I have all the recordings of Charlie Parker playing saxophone, and I want to say to my computer, only play me the parts of the recording where he is soloing. And somehow the computer has to know when there is a saxophone solo, which is a pretty hard thing to do. Maybe I've never heard of African music. I listen to the radio. I hear a piece of African music. I submit it to some kind of search engine. I find out what music it is just by sort of the sound of it, and then I figure out it's African music. So that type of application is the goal I plan for the future. Now, one thing that if you observe popularity distributions of music, you will observe that there are a few artists that some of their qualities have to do more with their bodies and their appearance than with their music, that are extremely popular. And a lot of other artists that I, as a musician, respect enormously, and I feel that they are extreme individuals and human beings that have tons to offer that are not well known. And I'm not going to go, I don't believe that they're not as popular because they don't deserve to be popular. It's just that they're not known. So my personal agenda is to try to make the number of pieces of music the average individual listens to more diverse, more personalized, more subjective, and essentially make people more aware of all this large universe of music that in many ways is unknown. So that's my little personal agenda, which is slightly different than probably what Sony or EMI would do if they were doing music retrieval. So now I'm done with this sort of motivation slides, and I'm going to go into the main part of my talk, which is content-based music analysis. So to start this process, I'm going to start with a little bit of a demo. So this is essentially content-based music information retrieval. So I'm not going to talk about how it's done. The idea is that you give it a piece of music. There is no metadata used at all. So all the computer has is the actual audio of the music. There is no artist, no genre, nothing used in metadata. And what you do is you pose a query and you get results. So I can't play all these examples. So what I decided to do is just sample the audience. So I'll start with Cormac, and he can pick one of those queries. I'll play it. Opera. Okay, so this is in a collection of, just to give you an idea, it's a collection of 3,500 clips. Now, it's a big story why it's hard to get a standardized collection. So this is my own personal little collection of music that I use. There's no Kenny G, but it's quite diverse. It's not necessarily, representative of the universe of music, but it does have a lot of different stuff, and some indication is all the stuff I have as queries. So here's the query. And here are the results. So it's 3 7-second clips that were returned. All of them, they are pretty good matches. Any other volunteers to pick one? Okay, so here is World. And here are the results. Now you notice that they are really from the same group, and actually that's because these are really good examples, because I'm giving a talk and I'm sort of demoing the system. I also picked up relatively popular things so that, you know, I would have a high probability that someone in the audience would know them. But again, the system doesn't know anything. As far as the system is concerned, they're all 30-second clips. There's no information about album or genre. I want to emphasize that. Any other volunteers? I'll do one more. Rock. Okay, this is a good one. And here are the results. So again, you know, it's arguable how good it is, but definitely in a collection of 3,000 clips, it's doing something. So then what I want to show you is a little bit, in a way, even more revealing than when it does really work really well, is what it does when it doesn't work so well. So here are some interesting queries, and I would, let's see, anyone volunteering? I have to do the art rock. Okay. Okay, so this is the query clip. You've got to be crazy. Okay, and these are the results returned. See the sunrise over us. Don't change it. So this is, so again, you know, this is not perfect. If you really hear those carefully, you can, and you kind of know what's happening, you can see why it does it. I mean, it doesn't have much knowledge of music. It's using some surface features. I will do 2 more of those. Any other volunteers? What? Klezmer. Okay. And here's another one. So again, you know, what I'm trying to get is maybe some of those matches are not that good, and some of it has to do just with the fact that there are no good examples of matches in that space of 3,000 songs, so it kind of tries to figure it out. Here's an even more interesting one. Well, this one I really actively tried to find something I thought it would really have a hard time. So This is the query. And this is the result. So it's so here's another one that my
I just wondering if you have any feeling how it scales. You don't want to use this in a huge collection.
actually, well, no, you do actually. It's funny, but similarity. If you do good similarity, it scales well because it's more likely in a large collection you will find something very similar. What happens though is you get too many matches that are so similar that they are kind of trivial. They become relatively boring. So then you need to basically have, and that's an interesting issue, is that there's this little area where it's interesting, and then if it's too good, it becomes a little bit too trivial. So you have to have a knob to adjust that. But actually it does scale relatively well. Anytime I increase my database, to really evaluate it, and I'll come into that, you have to do user studies very extensively, and it's a big pain to do that. But I mean, from my own perception, it does improve as you increase the size. I'll just do one final one for my friend Andy Schloss, who likes world music and Cuban and African music. So this is an interesting one. So this is a query. And the result is surprising, but not so surprising. The point is to focus on the rhythm rather than the actual texture, and I will get into that. So if you want, in this little search, you have seen the influence from African music to sort of Cuban, Latin to jazz in this, not to get too much credit for that. But anyway, so the interesting part, all of you here are familiar with the basics of, feature spaces and machine learning. So this is just simple nearest neighbor type of searching and returning a ranked list. So if you have some representation, here is your query, you just look for the closest matches in some space. So the name of the game is what can we come up with the right features to represent music. So that's what I'm going to talk about. There are three types of features that I have worked on. They're not necessarily a full set. There are other things you could take into account. That would be great. One set is essentially, for those of you familiar with speech recognition, just general kind of spectral features having to do with essentially the texture of the sound, sort of what instruments are playing, how bright it is, how frequently it changes. It's a very similar idea to texture in images, and it's a kind of a similar notion. Then there is this dividing line, and actually I could sort of, arguably, I could take credit for being one of the few people that have proposed that, is music-specific features. So things like mel frequency Cepstral coefficients work really well in speech recognition. They're nothing new. Things like beat histogram features, which represent the rhythm of a song, have nothing to do with other types of audio signal, only work for music. So it's interesting to incorporate a little bit musical aspects into your feature representation. So quickly about timbral texture, it's exactly sort of what I said. If you're listening to a radio in the background, washing the dishes in your kitchen, and there's a change from Mozart to Metallica, you sort of have this very low attention, very washed out sound, but you can tell that change. That's about what you try to model with timbral texture. So you want to differentiate mixtures of sound, possibly with the same sort of rhythm or pitch content, but with different instruments playing with a different kind of feeling. So again, in analogy to visual textures, sort of it's a statistical property of the thing, how it evolves. So quickly, all of you are familiar one way or another, either from signal processing or from just playing MP3s, of a spectrum display. So if you have a spectrum that shows how a signal is decomposed into different frequency bands, then you can essentially use that shape as your descriptor. There are a couple of different ways you can do it. I'm not going to go into details, but essentially they all boil down to reducing the shape of the spectrum into 4 or 5 numbers. So what you do is you take your spectrum, you calculate these numbers. For example, one would be the centroid, which is essentially if you try to balance the spectrum on your finger, the frequency where the energy on the left and the energy on the right is the same, and that's correlative brightness. Then you take that as your feature representation. So that's a simple spectral description. How can you calculate the spectrum? The most common technique is short-time Fourier transform. So you express your signal as your building block is essentially a sine waves. You can control their frequency, their amplitude. So one way to view this is as you pass your signals through these very narrow band filters, each filter outputs an amplitude and a frequency, and then you could just use those amplitude frequencies and drive a set of oscillators and sum them up and recreate your signal. So essentially your spectrum is really these amplitudes of each frequency, basically this representation right here. Another view of the same process is that you take your signal, you cut it into overlapping segments, and for each of those segments you calculate the Fourier transform and calculate the time varying spectrum that changes over time, and for each of those spectra you calculate your features. So by doing that process you have essentially a trajectory of feature vectors over time that represent how the music changes over time in terms of texture. A more recent technique is wavelets. So one thing that happens is if you do the short-time Fourier transform, you essentially have to choose a certain time resolution, which is how large those sine waves are going to be in terms of time. So if you view this as a time-frequency plane where time is this axis and frequency is this axis, essentially your building blocks can be viewed as these rectangles. So not as, in reality, they're more like little hills, but you know, in terms of if you just look at their standard deviation forms this rectangle. And there is the Heisenberg uncertainty, which tells you that the area of that rectangle has to be constant. So I can squeeze these rectangles and make my algorithm be very sensitive to time events and detect time events very accurately, but then I lose frequency resolution. I don't know what frequencies are playing. If I want to have good frequency resolution, then I need to use a lot of time, and then I lose you know, when things happen. So on the extreme case, if you take a Beethoven symphony, you could analyze every note very easily if you take the whole symphony, but you wouldn't know when any of the note was played. If you take a very short slice, you would know when everything was happening, but you wouldn't know the exact frequency. So you can't get away from that uncertainty, but you can kind of play around it, and that's what wavelets do. So what you do is for low frequencies, you use a lot of time. So you see you have this big fat rectangle, but you have good frequency resolution because this size is relatively small. For high frequencies, you know exactly when they happen, but you don't know the exact frequency. So you trade it off one way. Now, why is that relevant is that it turns out that our ears and our perceptual systems, although not as neatly mathematically as this model, are more close to this model than to a Fourier analysis. So both of these are useful to have, and I will also talk a little bit more about wavelets for rhythm detection. A filter bank view of the same approach is that if you, usually a standard process in signal processing, you want to kind of observe the behavior of a system, is you just feed it an impulse response. If you feed an impulse response to essentially a linear filter bank, so the short-time Fourier transform can be viewed as a linear filter bank, the output of each band will be the same duration signal with different frequencies. So a higher frequency will have more wiggles or less wiggles, but the output will be sort of the same duration. In contrast, the output of the wavelet transform is the same shape but scaled down each time. So this shape, I'm not very good at drawing, so the shapes look a little bit crappy, but really think about each of these are just a scale version of the other. And if you view it as a spectrum, essentially you have a narrow spectrum here, and then you could think of this as a Fourier transform, and you're summing all the bins. Here you sum a narrow range of bins, then you open it up, then you open it up. So, so one thing that's interesting for those of you who are, actually this is a good question to ask you right now. How many of you have some experience with playing a music instrument and reading music notation? Just, oh wow, really impressive. Good, very good. So I will be able to talk about some things that usually are hard to explain. That's very impressive, I have to admit. Okay, so if you think of a piano, the higher octave of a piano, if you take every octave of a piano is essentially double in frequency, doubling in frequency. So they get bigger and bigger if you view it as a linear scale, but we perceive it as a kind of continuous thing. So really our perception is logarithmic in some ways. Okay, so one of the most standard representations used in speech recognition is Mel frequency Cepstral coefficients, and you can use them also to model music. So the idea is that you take your short-time Fourier transform, and then you take the bins of the Fourier transform and you group them into relatively larger bands. And these bands are overlapping. And what happens is that there are 13 linearly spaced filters followed by 27 log-spaced filters. So for the linear filters, this is the relation between the center frequency and the boundaries of these triangles. For the logarithmic spaced frequency, these are the relations. So basically, the triangles remain the same, and then they start spreading out and spreading out. So that's the stage of Mel filtering, and that is supposed to model essentially how the human ear works. So you have sort of this relatively good approximation of how the human ear perceives different sounds. Yeah?
But there's a slight problem here, though, in that, like, when you're, like, in the ear, like, as you get, to give the wavelet argument, like, as your bandwidth increases, you get better time resolution, whereas here, it's like a fixed stepping short-time Fourier transform, you get the same time resolution even though you have different bandwidth.
Correct. So this is more an implementation efficiency in the sense that it's much faster to compute short-time Fourier transforms, and for the signals of interest, you typically can come up with a decent time resolution. So in both the case of speech recognition and music recognition, it turns out that that is actually okay, and you use short segments like 20 milliseconds, and it kind of works. There are some interesting approaches of not doing that, but I don't have time to talk about them. Then the next step is this relatively weird step that I'm not going to explain too much, of taking the log, and that's what's called the Cepstral coefficient. And what that does is essentially tries to decouple, if you think of the sound as a source filter, tries to make the source part and the filter part separated. And you can think of that as in frequency domain, if you have a source filter model, it's a convolution in time domain multiplication. In frequency domain, by taking the log, multiplying two things, you make them sum, so the relation becomes additive, which is a little bit easier to deal with. And finally, you take a discrete cosine transform that is just used for packing the energy of the coefficients in the first few coefficients of the DCT. So then out comes these Mel frequency Cepstral coefficients, which would be 40 numbers if you used all of them, but it turns out if you use the 10 first numbers, you get most of the information you need. So you can keep 10 or 13, or it depends on the application. So that's all relatively standard stuff. One little side note here that's kind of interesting is I did this work in simultaneous. It's one of those nice cases that you meet someone randomly at a conference and you have done exactly the same thing and you say, damn. But anyway, in ICAST 2000, the idea is that audio compression works essentially by having some kind of analysis filter bank. Then you get your filter bank outputs, and you have a specific budget of how many bits you can use for every sort of band of that filterbank model. Now, by quantizing these bands with your available bits, you introduce distortion to your signal. So the idea is that can you hide that distortion? And there's, by looking at the characteristics of the ear and masking, which is something I don't have time to talk about, basically you can hide the effect of that distortion so that it's inaudible, so you don't hear it. So basically, what comes out of the MP3 compression is essentially amplitudes for each of those analysis bands. So what you can do is a relatively straightforward idea. You can just take that as your spectrum representation and then compute a bunch of numbers like we did. That's your feature vector, and then see how well it does. And what I did in the paper is compare that approach with using directly a short-time Fourier transform or some other audio-based approach. So the advantage of that is that if you do that, this work that's done at encoding time, which is already there for free, can be used for your analysis. So rather than decompressing the audio and then running your audio analysis, you can do your audio analysis while you decompress the audio. And that sort of takes back of this sort of design constraint of perceptual audio coding, that it's a relatively slow and painful encoding process, and it's a much faster decoding process. So what you do is you take advantage of all this work done here to do feature analysis. So it's compressed domain feature extraction, which is something that video people have also been doing. So summary of Timbral texture features, you have some type of time frequency analysis. You use signal processing tools like the short-time Fourier transform or the discrete wavelet transform, and also more perceptually based approaches like MFCCs. There's one final step that's really important for texture, is that you don't look only at short-term windows. You look at a little bit larger windows. So maybe this window will be about 1 second, whereas each line of this spectrogram would be 20 milliseconds. So you can think of this as 40 lines of your spectrogram, and you compute means and variances of your features over that texture window. So the reason is that music is relatively more long-term from speech, and you want to capture this statistical quality of how this kind of image is different than this image rather than just the short-term quality. And if you do an experiment like just computing these features and classifying, let's say, classical music versus rock music, and you just play this trick of adjusting the size of this window, you will see that you get significant increases, like 10 or 15% improvements in classification accuracy just by increasing that size up to a certain level and capturing the texture of that sound. So what are these features good for? Well, they're relatively good for telling apart, let's say, classical music from rock music, because the frequency characteristics and stuff are just so different, and sort of the statistical characteristics. They capture a little bit of rhythm in the sense of the variance of those features within that window capture some aspects of rhythm, but they don't model it directly. Okay, so now modeling directly rhythm. Rhythm is movement in time. It has origins in poetry, so it's the sequence of accents in poetry. There is one sort of the easiest characteristics of rhythm that most people can understand is tempo. The easiest definition of tempo, although it's sort of problematic, is a foot tapping definition. So if I play a song and you tap your foot with it, the frequency of that tapping is what we call tempo of the music. Now, some of you might tap it twice as fast or whatever, but sort of on some level, that's a good definition. So in a more complex way to view rhythm, that it's a hierarchical semi-periodic structure over the music. One interesting aspect is that rhythm is linked to motion. So if you look at sort of what are the frequencies used in rhythmic events, they're the frequencies we can hit things or strike things or move our arms. If you make something too fast, there's a certain point that if you increase the speed enough, nobody, even, rave partiers can dance anymore because it's just too fast. And same thing with too slow. So there's a certain range of frequencies that are interesting. So one thing that wavelets are really good for is having relatively accurate time domain analysis. So wavelets are interesting because they have been very successful in image processing. They haven't been as successful in audio processing. And part of the reason is the emphasis that people have on coding and compression. So for coding and compression of images, wavelets work really well. For coding of audio, they don't work so well, mainly because audio is much more sensitive to phase information, and wavelets are not as good as that in that respect. But if you're doing analysis, they're a perfectly good tool. And this is something I can show you. This is a drum loop. So drum loops are used by DJs and people like that. They're just clean drum signals. So here's how it sounds. So then you can look at a wavelet transform. So this is a low frequency band of a wavelet transform with a little bit more processing. And this is a high frequency band of the wavelet transform. And even visually, you can see it separates the bass drum from the other stuff. So here is the sound. Now, it doesn't sound as good as the bass drum, but in terms of detecting the events, it works really well. Here is the high stuff. So, yeah. Well, with a little bit of tweaking, but pretty much straightforward. You have, if you use a discrete wavelet transform, you have to upsample, things like that. But, yeah. So here is a method of rhythm analysis that I propose. It's similar to other methods, but it's slightly different, and it's based on self-similarity. So you separate the bands of the signal, you calculate self-similarity in each band, and then you sort of compute. So I will go over it. So you start with a discrete wavelet transform. You extract these outputs. Now, if you have music, these outputs will not be clean percussive signals, will be nodes. So you have to do an envelope extraction stage. So you don't capture the frequencies, you actually capture the events. So you do an envelope extraction and you get these envelopes. Then you normalize these envelopes. Then you sum them. What will happen when you sum them is that envelopes that are similar and in phase will enhance each other. Envelopes that are less similar or out of phase will kind of destructively interfere with each other. So if you then take the summation signal and run autocorrelation, what you get is the peaks of your autocorrelation function are the various periodicities. So here you see there is one periodicity that's that one. There's one periodicity that's a longer one. These will be those two peaks. And again, I apologize for my drawing. Then what you can do, so you do that at relatively short windows, every 3 seconds. You select those peaks with peak picking, and then you accumulate those peaks in what I call a beat histogram. So a beat histogram is really a histogram of what are the different periodicities in your sound. So if you were thinking of a piece of music, it would be the quarter notes, the half notes, the whole notes. What are the main repetition elements? Here's another example of how it sounds. This is your input. This is the low frequency. Again, you have some aliasing or whatnot, but you don't care. You're doing analysis. So, and this is the high stuff. So here is what is the output of a beat histogram, and this is a representation of the whole song. So if you have a piece of classical music that doesn't have a very strong sense of, very regular rhythm, so it might have a pulse, it might have other, but it's not a very clear periodicity, you get a relatively flat histogram. So the y-axis is beats per minute. The x-axis. The y-axis is essentially beat strength, or how much self-similar the signal is. So if you have a hip-hop signal, you see this clear peak here at about 90 beats per minute. I'll play this example so this becomes clearer. So if you try to tap your foot with this example, you will find it's not very, not the strongest sense of regular rhythm you can have. And here is a very, very strong example. If you can't tap your foot with this one, I don't know, trouble. So this is about 90-something beats per minute. Here you see that's the double of that, and so forth. One thing, if you think of two pieces of music, a piece of country music at 80 beats per minute and a piece of hip-hop at 80 beats per minute, what will happen is this peak in hip-hop will be much larger because it's much more self-similar. So there are a couple of features that I want to point out. One is that by this representation, you capture a couple of different things about rhythm. You capture the tempo, you capture how strong the sense of tempo is. So this beat strength, actually I don't have time to talk about it, but I did a user study, and it's actually something that people perceive consistently. If you ask people to sort pieces of music by beat strength, they do it very reliably, and pieces that are at the same tempo. So it is a valid kind of thing. The other, one of the biggest, and this is a nice little trick that I love to talk about, is that frequently people, when they do analysis, we have this tendency to always try to come up with a perfect solution. So people have been fighting to get really good beat detection for ages, whereas the most important information is at the failure of your beat detector. So if you're looking at characterizing pieces of music, as you can see, pretty much you can come up with a rule. If your histogram is relatively flat, it's classical. If it's not flat, it's rock or pop or some sort of that. So just wrapping around your failure and making it information is an interesting trick. And as long as you are using machine learning, even imperfect information can feed it to your system and improve it. Okay, multiple pitch detection. I don't have that much time to go over this, but basically it's a paper published by Tolonen and Caroline, and it's engineering simplification of a perceptual pitch detector. So it's basically something that outputs similar results to what people who model the human ear do, but works much more efficiently. It basically separates the signal into two bands, above 1 kilohertz and below 1 kilohertz. The one below is directly detected for periodicity. The above one is low-pass filtered and half-wave rectified, so it's more of an envelope approach. The two periodicity detections are summed. Then there is this summary autocorrelation that removes the effect of harmonics. And essentially what you get in the end is a histogram of pitch candidates. So it's basically how many C's, how many G's, how many E's you had over your whole song. Now, obviously, this will make a lot of errors, but statistically, over the whole song, it will get some information. So this type of information is useful. For example, country music has fewer chord changes than jazz music. So sort of a jazz piece will have a more diverse histogram with more pitches, whereas a country music will only have pitches at the main chord. So you can use that type of information. For those of you who are in music theory, you can do this little neat trick here of converting this histogram that's chromatic into a circle of fifths, and that has certain properties in the sense that things that are close in the circle of fifths are close harmonically, and that is important if you know music theory, which I don't have time to explain. One thing that's a little important note is that pitch is very similar to rhythm, only at higher frequencies. So if I start tapping this thing here, you're hearing discrete events. If I start tapping it too fast, and I could continue that, you still hear discrete events. But if I could make my speed really fast, if I had superhuman muscles, if I was Superman, I could get a continuous sound. The fact that we hear a continuous sound is a total perceptual thing. There's nothing in the signal. The signal could be continuously getting closer and closer, and at one point there's a threshold where we say this is one thing. And it has to do with perception, the fact that if something is emitting regular sounds at that frequency, it's probably coming from the same source, so I might as well perceive it as the same source. So here's this example. I'm not Superman, but I can program. So here's the same example in code. Now, if I don't have a plot of the signal, but it's exactly the same grains getting shorter and shorter. So that's one thing that's important, is there's not much difference between pitch detection and rhythm detection, only they are done at different frequencies, and sort of rhythm is done at envelopes, pitch detection is done at signals. Okay, I'm not going to talk about this too much, but one thing you can do is, for those of you who are musical, you can take your FFT and group all the octaves together. So anything that's spaced an octave apart gets folded into one thing. So it's the same thing as what people who have done 20th century music call pitch class. and you get what's called a Chroma-based representation. So if you had something like this originally, you get something like this. This is a singer, and it's basically collapsing the fact that octaves are perceived in the similar way. So you have all the C's in one kind of bin and all the D's in one bin. And it's very similar to the pitch histogram. It's just a different way of calculating it. Rather than extracting individual pitches, you take all the energy and group it into those bins. Okay, one quick example. Actually, I won't have time to play these audio examples, so if you are interested, maybe in the end of the talk, if anyone is interested, is to look at how these individual features affect things. So here I have a query, and I would play the one with just a timbral texture, the one with the rhythm, and one using the full feature set. But what you can do is you can do a user study where you play the results, you have users rank how good they are, and compare the results. And this is the feature performance. So this would be random kind of thing. This is by adding texture, by adding rhythm, and by using the full data set. So you see you get these increases. It's just, it doesn't matter. The details of how this graph was done is irrelevant. What I'm trying to say is that adding these extra features that capture music-specific aspects does give you an important improvement over just taking your standard speech recognition front end and feeding it into a music classifier. So having a domain-specific approach does help. It's not solves everything, but does help. So as I mentioned, similarity retrieval is hard to evaluate. You have to do extensive user studies. So another approach that you can do is to do automatic musical genre classification. Now, genres are interesting because they're really labels that are created by humans. There's no official committee that says what's rock or what's jazz. But they do have statistical properties of the type that we have been modeling that can be used to describe them. So they are what when I give a talk to, I don't know, certain groups of people, I say that it's used to structure audio collections. But really, from a research perspective, genre classification is a great way, without doing extensive user studies, to evaluate music content features. So if you have a set of features and they do well at genre classification or better than another set of features, well, probably the one that does better somehow captures something more about what we perceive as content in music. So approach is standard statistical supervised learning. You have your labeled samples, your unlabeled samples. You try to find the probability of what's the probability of a certain sample, let's say, being speech, and it's an unknown sample. Using Bayes' rule, you can convert it essentially, and the name of the game becomes to estimate this quantity, which is a probability density function of that, what is given a particular class. So what's the if you know that it's speech, what's the probability? And estimating this probability density function is at the core of a lot of machine learning methods. So for example, one thing you could say is, well, I assume that this is a Gaussian distribution, and then the name of the game is how can you estimate the means and the covariance matrix from your samples, which is a very simple procedure. Relatively more complicated procedure is if you have a Gaussian mixture model, then you have to estimate weights for the mixture, the means for every mixture component, and the covariance for every mixture component. But again, all this is standard machine learning pattern classification. You can use support vector machines. You can use neural networks, whatever is your favorite. This is nothing, it's used in every field. So here are some results. So this is, first of all, I want to start with this study, which was done with 52 subjects by a musicologist. It was called Scan the Dial. So the idea was, how long do you need to hear to music before you know what genre it is and switch the radio station? So if I hate rap music, how long do I have to stay on a radio station before I scan for a different one? So one interesting result, I won't have time to demo it, is that with 1/4 of a second, you do 40% on a 10 genre. This is 10 genres. So chance would be 10%. So you're doing 4 times better than chance with only 1/4 of a second. Now, I don't know how much you can oralize 1/4 of a second, but it's a really short blip of sound. It's not at all lots of information. You have no rhythm. It's just kind of this grungy texture and you already get a 40% lift. Then you increase the amount of time, and then at about 30 seconds, you peak to 70%. And then if you use more than 3 seconds, you don't get any better. Like all the information you need, at least for genre, is enough. 3 seconds is enough to capture most of it. So the rest 30% that is remaining here is just subject disagreement of what a particular genre is. So that's important to understand that 100% genre classification is impossible to achieve even by humans. So it's not, it's not realistic to hope for that. This is results on a different collection. It's the same number of genres, but it's not the same collection. So they are not directly comparable. So even though it seems like I'm doing the same performance, this is not. This is just an indication. So you get 10% by random classification. Then in my initial published paper, I had 60% using Gaussian mixture models. Later, I did a paper with someone else who used support vector machines. So for those of you who are fans of support vector machines, they actually do work better, at least in this particular case. So you gain about 10%. Yeah?
What you said here is 100% accuracy. I mean, does that mean that there's something wrong with the definition of genre?
Yeah.
Or that there's not, what do you call it, that consensus about genre? There's so much kind of overlap.
Exactly. Yeah, that's about 30%. Actually, I will quantify this a little bit more. So yeah.
How long are the clips for the background?
Oh, this is actually, yeah, that's a very good question. This is based on 30-second clips. So in a way, these results are slightly unfair in the sense that it uses more data than this side. So if you actually use only 3 seconds, these guys go slightly lower. And to tell you the truth, I haven't done it in a real, like some of the features, I assume relatively a 30-second clip, and I didn't do the best job I could do to get 3 seconds. The only thing is that even if you use 30 seconds here, you still get 70%. So it's sort of okay. Okay, so now the important thing is, this is how most people do genre classification, is they take the labels of Amazon or take the labels themselves or whatever and get these results. Now that's all good, and it's a good way to publish. But if you really want to do the right thing is a hard thing, which is to do a user study. So it's not as hard as this user study, but I just found this randomly on the web. It's pretty cool. So this is work I did with some people at the University of Ghent. Actually, I didn't do much of it. They just used some of my stuff and then contacted me. And it was really great work. So what they did is they took subjects, 27 human listeners, and they took a collection of 160 tracks. And then here is a histogram which shows basically number of tracks that how many, like basically this tells that 27 out of 27 agreed on 20 tracks that they are the same genre. So for 20 tracks, everyone agreed. So this is basically number of tracks. This is how many subjects agreed on their definition. So as you can see, for a fair number of tracks, people had quite a bit of disagreement. Like 10 people thought something, 10 people thought something else. So what you can do is take the ground truth. So what you say, my ground truth is what the majority of human subjects say a particular track is. So if I have 27 users and 20 of them say it's rock, then I use that as ground truth. And then take the human accuracy. You have a range from about 57% to 86%. So what that means is there are certain users that are really agree with the average kind of consensus, and some of them that completely disagree.
But the level of consensus is also going to be an artifact of what, like for rock and pop, for Britney Spears, there's probably a lot of consensus.
Exactly.
For a lot of world music, there's probably going to be less consensus.
Yeah, so that is something. Here are the labels that were used in this study. So obviously other is going to be a problematic category. So, but at least this gives you a certain kind of range of indication. So you get an average of about 76% agreement, which is approximately the same as the previous user study on a completely different set. So that's good. Then if you take only the reliable ones, so if you threshold your ground truth to 18 votes, rather than majority, then you get slightly better results. And here is how it compares with the automatic. So this is random, this is automatic, and this is the average human, and these are the error bars. So as you can see, basically the computer is approximately equal to the worst human user. Now, these results were done without using support vector machines, so maybe you could get a slight boost on that using a little bit more, fancier classifier. But it shows that we are sort of okay. I mean, it's definitely, there's a lot of room for improvement. But what I really like with these results is that they really compare it with the right ground truth. Comparing it with arbitrarily chosen labels, and even worse, labels chosen by the researcher, is always sort of suspicious. Okay, I've shown this demo so many times that I'm sick of it, so I'm only going to describe it. But it's just this live real-time display. These bars go up and down. Radio comes in or whatever, and they just go up and down, and you see them going up and down, and it looks really cool. You have to take my word for it. Audio segmentation. I wanted to show this because it's work I did on news classification. So even though it's not as interesting as music, I do some more serious work. So here's a news clip. So that's this part.
The last great explorer, Jacques Cousteau, has died in Paris at age 87.
Part of early crime is being preempted.
Okay, so as you can see, just by looking at the spectrogram, if you have an audio editor, you could easily tell that there's a change from music to the speaker. Here, it's really hard. If you have taken the MIT class on reading spectrograms, maybe you can tell that this is a different speaker than this one. And normal human beings don't. So they would like an algorithm that would label these parts automatically. So the idea of audio segmentation is to only detect the changes in the texture, not to tell that this is a male speaker or this is a female speaker or this is a saxophone solo. Only say, oh, the texture that was here has changed significantly, so there is a boundary. So it's a way to break up your audio in kind of interesting chunks. So this works the following way. The idea is very simple. If you think of your feature vector as a ball that moves around in space, as long as it's in one texture, it will be moving in one region of the space. And when there is a new texture, it will jump to another region of the space and move relatively homogeneously. So what you want to detect is these gaps at the feature vector trajectory. So what you can do is you can take the difference between successive feature vectors. You can normalize it using a Mahalanobis distance so that you equalize the contribution of each feature and take care of dynamic range and correlations. And then you can take the derivative of this different signal, and the peaks of that derivative signal are going to correspond to texture changes. So if you just do picking on that, then you get those boundaries. So I'm not going to talk about detail, but it works relatively well, as most cases. Sometimes it doesn't, but it does do a decent job. And the nice part of it is you don't need any training data. So this is a completely data-driven approach. You just chop your audio into meaningful segments. Now here's an interesting problem which shows the importance of choosing the right representation. So since all of you are musicians almost, you know that you have symbolic representations like MIDI or scores are easy to manipulate but have a relatively flat performance. Audio representations are very expressive because there are someone playing, but they are very opaque and unstructured. Like if I have an audio recording of a symphony, I can't say go to measure 40. If I have a MIDI file of the same symphony, I can do that. So the idea is if I have both, can I align them? Can I find in the audio where each event starts? Now, for a monophonic signal, you can imagine that this is relatively easy. Well, you do some pitch detection, and then you do some alignment. The idea is, can you do it for polyphonic audio? And the idea is to use this idea of a similarity matrix, which can be used for a couple of other things. So what you do is you take your feature vectors. So one axis is your feature vectors over time, with time from 0 to the length of the song going this way. And your other axis is also your feature vectors from time 0 going to that. So the diagonal is basically comparing feature vectors to themselves. And then here you have different delays. So you compare each feature vector with delayed versions of itself So wherever there are periodicity patterns, you get these nice kind of rectangular structures. So if you put a very structured piece of music, like a Bach prelude or something like that, that's very, very well formed, you get these really nice looking visuals. And so really, you can do it in MATLAB in about half an hour, and it's a nice way to visualize music. So what we do is a similar thing, only here we do it with two different pieces. So here we have an audio version of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which is generated from a MIDI file just by running it through a synthesizer. So it sounds pretty crappy. And here we have a real audio recording. These two have very different lengths. Like this one, I think, is 7 minutes. This one is about 5 minutes. So they're very different durations. And the idea is, can we find where they match? So if you try to do this matching with MFCCs, fails completely, because obviously the sound of the real orchestra and the sound of the crappy MIDI synthesizer are so different that there's no way it will work. But if you use the right representation, either a Chroma or a pitch histogram representation that captures essentially the chords of the song or some statistical information about pitches, then you can do it. So here is just some examples. This is the audio from MIDI. So it sounds relatively flat. Here is the same piece in an audio recording. So here, one interesting thing. So what you try to do is essentially find the diagonal of this matrix. Now, this matrix is not a self-similarity matrix. It's a similarity matrix between two different sequences. This is sort of dynamical programming type approach, and you get this optimal alignment path. There's this interesting thing here, which I wanted to, like if you see it, you see there's a little kink. It's not very clear in the slide. So the question is, what happens there? Well, it turns out that there's an oboe solo, and the MIDI performance just plays it on time, whereas the human performer slows down very much and plays it very expressively. So here is the MIDI performance. And here is the acoustic one. It still works. Yeah, we took this and converted it to piano and did it, and it still works. You can also generate your chroma directly from the MIDI, but yeah. Now, it worked for this particular example. If you try to do a Beatles song, it doesn't work as well because you have vocals. So it's not, the solution to the world. But okay. I'm not going to have that much time. I'm already running. I guess it's okay to go a little bit over. Is that fine? Okay. So principal component analysis, I'm not going to explain it. I will assume most of you know what it is. It's just a dimensionality reduction technique. The main point is that it's a dimensionality reduction technique that depends on a correlation matrix. And the data set you calculate that correlation matrix is important. So it's a dimensionality reduction technique that depends on some large collection of sort of sample signals. So that's interesting because, for example, if you view the same piece of music and you do PCA on that piece of music based on a collection of jazz songs or a collection of rock songs, you get a different PCA representation for those two. So the same content can have different representations, which is important for visualization. So this is just an idea. You take your PCA vectors, do some little massaging of them, and convert them to color stripes. So this goes from left to right. And what the nice part is that immediately visually, you can see interesting features. So you can see that the first half looks like this part, and the second half looks like this part, and there's a first part and a second part, and you see that right away, rather than having to listen to 6 or 5 minutes of music to determine that. So this is this piece. I can't play all of them, but this is just showing the change from one texture to another. This is relatively fat, complex orchestral texture. And here it changes. It's like here. So what's really interesting is that this file here is a waveform that is colored with the same process, only instead of having a rectangle, I do it over the waveform, and is exactly the same audio file as this one. And the colors are completely different, the sections are completely different, because I used a different set to do my principal component analysis. So this is principal component analysis using only the file itself, so it shows more sort of relations within the file and more detailed information. So that's just a little side note. So I do some user interface stuff and visualization stuff that I don't have that much time to talk about. So I finished the main part of my talk, which is the content-based analysis. Now I'm going to talk really quickly about some future challenges and some quick overview of what I'm doing now. So to me, the main challenge is auditory scene analysis. So that's where we are really severely lacking, is if you have multiple sounds overlapping, starting at different times, some of them are speech, some of them are music, some of them are sound effects, how can you deal with that complex information? So issues like stream formation, sound source identification, so saying, oh, there's a saxophone playing. That's an easier problem than separating the saxophone. So sound source separation is a harder problem than sound source identification. And it's all related, speech recognition in noisy environments, instrumentation detection, so telling there's a drum and a saxophone playing, model-based instrument tracking, so you have a model of what a saxophone sounds like and you want to kind of follow it through a score. All these are really interesting problems that, to my knowledge, no one has solved even close to satisfactory. So obviously, all the topics I covered are not completely solved, but at least we have made some decent progress. This is very open new area. So if you're interested, especially for students, these are really cool topics. So some questions that are a little bit more philosophical. To me, the essence of music perception is time perception. More than any other art form, with the exception probably of dance, music plays with our notions of time. What is really interesting about music is that although it's a very complex signal, it's very abstract and has very little external semantics. So in speech recognition, you have all this language, huge model riding with you that tells you that a dog is a mammal and mammals have 4 legs and all that knowledge representation. In music, your semantic model is much less complicated. So in a way, you get sort of the benefits of the complexity without the additional complexity that complicates your job. So I think that music understanding is key to understanding the human brain. Now, that might be a little bit controversial claim, but I do think that the reason, why do we like music so much? Why are we so different? Why every culture in the world likes music? And it's mainly because it plays with our sense of time. Human beings have the most expanded time scales than any other organism on this planet. We can envision our death as an individual. Lately, we can envision our death as a species. We can envision our birth. We just go on all these time scales all over the place, short-term time scales, long-term time scales. And that's what music is about. It's all about short-term dependencies, long-term dependencies, longer-term dependencies. So how is one, and another more practical question is, how is music going to change with digital music distribution? So I already asked Cormac this question, which is not exactly that one, but my question was more specific. If you look at the distribution of buying songs in iTunes, is it different than the distribution of songs playing in the radio? My suspicion is that it is. I think that it's more diverse, more flightened out, more personal, more subjective. I don't think everyone is buying Britney Spears at iTunes. I don't have the data, but that's my feeling. And I have a feeling that no matter what copyright protection is, just these are all details. They're all going to go away as devices become cheaper and digital distribution becomes common. The whole way music is produced and distributed and thought of is going to change. The same way that writing books changed with the invention of the press, the same way that music changed with the invention of recording. It's just a complete change. And it's just happening. It goes too fast that we don't even realize it. Okay, so quick overview of my current research, and then we are done. This is this is the work that I've done with Ajay Kapoor, Peter Dreesen. Actually, I should mention Andy Slosh, too, who is my friend here. And Ajay has built a sitar that is sort of enhanced with sensors. So there are two types of sensors. There are sensors on the frets. There's a network of resistors that detects pitch by sort of where you press each string. And then there is this sensor. When you play sitar, you sort of strum by having your thumb attached. So by looking at the pressure of the thumb, you can detect the upward or downward motion. And this is some sound example of Ajay playing this thing. So I do, so the idea here, which is really where I came in, is that, so the idea is the following, that it's clear that some of that information, for example, the downward-upward stroke, is somehow encoded in the audio. Like, if you have a good ear, you can tell it. But it's not a very direct mapping. So the idea is what we do is we use the sensor to collect training data, and then use linear regression to build essentially a virtual sensor, a pseudo-sensor. And we have a really nice machine learning loop because we can collect as much training data as we want. And once we have shown that what our model does as well as the sensor, we just throw it away. So it's a good way to kind of start by having the sensors and then get an instrument that is as sort of digital as the sensor-based instrument that doesn't have the sensors. Some other projects. Recently, I just had a paper on query by beatboxing. So beatboxing is where you do a rhythm with your mouth. This is how it sounds. These students are pretty good at it, actually. So this is a human doing the rhythm with their mouth and their sound. This is not a drum machine. It's another one. So what we can do is we can detect the individual bass drum and hi-hat sounds and then map them to other sounds, like a MIDI sound, so you can create your own drum loops. And then I also did some simple drum loop style classification, so things like I don't know what they mean. There's like dub and R&B, and I was told that they are different styles. I was actually surprised. I did a user study on myself, and I could reliably identify them, even though I felt that I was randomly picking the answer, almost. But it's okay. And then I do a couple of sort of less research-like projects, but I think pretty cool projects with undergrads. So these are the best students that sort of choose to do directed studies, which is a project-oriented course. So one of them did a MATLAB interpreter in SML, which is a functional language. So we can, he has the whole thing. You can do nested arrays, everything, an interpreter for that. It's pretty cool. And then this is ELIZA, for those of you who know ELIZA, the sort of famous AI program for music recommendations. So you type, Maestro is the program, so it will ask you, do you like music? Do you like rap music? Yes. And then you just chat with it, and it just keeps playing and recommending things and stuff. So this is some people who have used my software. This is the coolest project of all. They did a game where the terrain of the game is adapted to the music you are listening to. So this is the sort of flat, hilly music, flat grass plains, and this is the rocky stuff. So the topography of the island changes, and then some other stuff doesn't matter. So I would this is the end. This is sort of some of my visualization stuff running at the Princeton display wall, which is this huge, nice, not very expensive, but still not something I can have in my bedroom. Wall, but I do hope that one day I'll, sit in my bed and all my room will have, a galaxy of music pieces, and I'll be able to say, zoom in the blues section, play me something faster. I don't like that song, take it out or send it to the outskirts of the galaxy and have all these cool displays. If you're interested in more, you can check my webpage, and I've been sort of advertising ISMIR, which is the Music Retrieval Conference this year, and it's in Barcelona, which is a really nice place. So if you want to sort of go, it's sometime in October. And there is this sort of central website for music information retrieval that has links to all past ISMIR conferences, music IR mailing list, and online papers and all sorts of goodies. So thank you very much. And any questions or?
So this search is based on comparing each item, comparing your query to each item in the visit. Is there any way to do indexing?
Yeah, there are plenty of ways to do indexing, but it's all, nothing music specific. I mean, there are ways to do multidimensional indexing. Actually, it's not that bad. I mean, I just do plain linear search, and it works fast enough. Because the feature space is like 30 features for each song. So if I was scaling to 1 million songs, then you can do some, like in Mood Logic where I did audio fingerprinting, it's a pretty sophisticated scheme that you can do efficient searching. But for that, I really care about the features as long as. Scrolling. Oh, okay. Yeah, so that's fine. Chroma.
I was wondering about how you get the feature vectors from your Histograms, pitch and rhythm.
Oh, I didn't mention that. But yeah, well, it's kind of a similar idea. You just pick a bunch of numbers. And actually, I have no idea if these are the best numbers to pick. If they just kind of work. You pick the height of the main peak and the position of the main peak. So that's the tempo and the sort of how self-similar it is. No, it's actually 6. And then you do the secondary peak, and then you do the relation. So if it's a 2-4 or a 4-4 or a 3-4. One feature that I haven't explored is the width of those peaks. If your rhythm is very constant, they will be narrow. If you sort of have variations in your rhythm, they will spread out. But I haven't looked at that. I mean, you can see it in plots sometimes, but I haven't sort of put it into a whole thing. And an interesting side note is you can do the sort of creepy machine learning approach of throwing the whole histogram into a support vector machine, which deals well with large feature spaces. And then you do get better results than if you throw the 4 or 5 numbers, which somehow means there's a little bit more information buried in that thing, but I don't know where, or it's an active topic. Yeah?
So it goes to the question that Chris asked earlier about how this scales. I mean, if you can take a collection of a few thousand objects and kind of categorize it into 30 coarse categories. But at some point, do the feature set you're using, fail to be able to resolve, particularly when, within your genre, there's a lot of ambiguity and overlap at the boundaries. If you took one of those subgenres, like jazz, and you tried to sub-classify that, are these features useful, or is it just going to break down?
Oh, no, they are. Actually, they work better, sort of, finer. But the point is, you don't, like, the way I envision it is you will never have any labels. If you have any labels, it will be your own. Like, you will say, this is the music I listen to when I wake up in the morning. And you will train a model that will take unknown songs and, put, with some probability output whether you will like them in the morning or not. And it will be genres, but person-specific. And really, I think if you have good browsing tools, not searching, but browsing, music is about finding pieces that you like. It's not like I don't want to go find, my favorite song. I know what it is. I can just type the name and hear it. It's about exploring. So I think that's the key. And genres are just inconvenience. Like, I'm famous in a way for my genre classification paper, but I think it's stupid. Genres should not exist. You have a good search engine and a good feature representation. And if you combine it with the other data we were talking, like if you combine it with collaborative filtering, metadata, usage patterns, playlist information, and sort of fold it all into one system, then you have a cool system. But the main goal for me, is how can you find music that you never have heard of that you think is really good? That's the challenge. And obviously, never listening to Kenny G is a very noble goal.
Well, that's something we can all agree with.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Thanks, speaker again.
And feel free to email me, with any additional stuff.
Yes.
Thanks. Oh, okay. So you are. Oh, okay. Oh, man. I hope I haven't, you have emailed me and I have been rude to you or anything.
No, I now have a log email right here about all this stuff.
Okay.
Good. Great job.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I sort of tried to make it